Thank you so much for joining Holistic Child and Families Neurodiversity Affirming Consult Group. This is a totally free group out of Seattle. We just um, request donations. If you learn anything or experience any sort of growth opportunities with our community, that's sort of the way that we get by. We just want everybody to have more education and to grow our community of thoughtful providers. And we have a wonderful provider from speech therapy, sort of like wing of our population. I'm just going to introduce Kendra Thomas, and I'm so excited about this presentation on different ways of understanding language learning and how I can be supportive to the humans that I work with. So thank you so much for being here, Kendra.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Kendra. I use she, her pronouns. I am a speech language pathologist, as Marie said. Um, I started working in a nonprofit multidisciplinary clinic, working with OT and PT. And we also had special education providers and some mental health specialists, but not a ton. And then I've worked at a few other outpatient clinics, and I'm currently in the schools. So I am in my 8th year of practice and have loved learning about Gestalt language processing and how it impacts all aspects of life. And I'm hoping that this will be helpful for not just speech therapists, but everyone. And then try to include, I know that a lot of people here work with both children, but also families of children with disabilities. And so my hope is that it can help providers understand patients themselves, but also understand how to help families advocate for things that might be helpful. Because advocating for accommodations and changes to be made in the school system is difficult. It's difficult for me, and I actually work here. So just giving some ideas of what people might find helpful and can so I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. And are you seeing presenter view, or you are seeing presenter view? Okay, let's pause that. It worked a second ago to only show the slides. Okay, let me try this again. And I apologize. I was going to try and do dual monitors, and this isn't my normal room, and so it just got a little wonky. Okay, so I'm going to try this the way that I did it before. Share this and share this. All right. Are you seeing slides or are you seeing the PowerPoint?
Just seeing
Pushing
your
the slide.
slides.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. And still?
Yep, just your slides.
Okay, perfect. Okay, sorry. I think we figured it out then. Okay. Oh dear. Okay. All right, so this is Echolalia 101. A lot of people have heard of the term echolalia, but it is better known now as Gestalt Language Processing. Echolalia is, however, still kind of a good way to catch people's attention because that is a common medical term used to describe the immediate repetition of speech or language or intonation of either music or phrases or different things like that. So some of the things that I'm hoping to discuss today are just understanding what echolalia and Gestalt language learning are, their role in language development, how people can try and recognize if someone might be a Gestalt language processor, ways to communicate with them more effectively because it does impact not only expressive language, but also their comprehension and processing of things like transitions and changes to their environment as well. Some practical IEP supports and just school supports in general that families can ask for. And then I included a host of other resources at the end so that if you would like to learn more or do your own additional education or supplementary education, that you know where to seek out some trusted resources. So first, I am curious, who has heard of Gestalt language processing? Apologize for the bell. I'm not sure the level of familiarity. So if you could just type in the chat, like if you have heard of it, yes or no. And then because I can't really see the chat, Marie, if you could let me know. Yeah.
We've got a lot of people saying yes, and some saying yes, but I don't really understand it.
Okay, great. Perfect. All right. So that helps me know that we at least, yeah, it's not a totally foreign term. Um, so there are some terms I'm going to go over that I will be using. I am not going to go over neurodiversity terms, since I think most people in this group understand and are familiar with those. You'll hear me use the term non-speaking, minimally speaking, or non-reliable speakers rather than nonverbal. This is the preferred terminology of the population. Nonverbal tends to have the connotation of not capable of communication or capabilities, and that is not true. We think of speech being simply the like physical mouth production. People also say mouth words. So if you do hear me say minimally speaking or non-speaking, that's what that means. Apraxia of speech is very common in the autistic population. It is a motor planning disorder, and a lot of times it means that there is a brain-body disconnect, which many people know about in general with the autistic and other neurodivergent populations. This comes out a lot of times with Gestalt language processors because things that are rote and very highly intoned, like music, are more automatic and easier to produce. And there's also a lot of people who talk about when they do say things with their mouth, it is not necessarily what they actually meant to say. And so there is a lot of advocacy for trusting the meaning behind things and taking everything as meaningful, but not everything as literal, and making sure that they have access to multiple modalities. So low-tech communication supports like picture boards, high-tech communication supports like a speech generating device, sign language, body language, all those things. Echolalia, like I said, is kind of a general term that's used. Some people refer to immediate echolalia, which is I say something like, hey, how's it going? And then somebody immediately responds, hey, how's it going? Sometimes this is an indicator of being a Gestalt language processor, but this also can just be an indicator of some receptive language or processing difficulties in general. Some people do that to kind of encode information into their phonological loop in their memory. So it's not always an indicator of being a Gestalt language processor. Delayed echolalia is something that somebody has heard and then repeats exactly how they heard it later. And that is a stronger indicator that somebody is a Gestalt language processor. However, this is something that everyone does to a certain extent. Many people reference movies and reference TV shows, and those are Gestalts when we use those. It is not an uncommon phenomena, but there are some people who learn language primarily through that method. And when I use the term Gestalt, this is also kind of a preferred term versus scripting. A lot of times people refer to echolalia as, oh, they're scripting. They're saying the script from a movie or something like that. And there's kind of been a shift away from the use of the term of scripting to refer to that. And now scripting more refers to as like, okay, I'm going to plan out what I'm going to say for something in advance, like in a situation that I'm anxious about. And we use the term Gestalt more for things that have been repeated directly from something or someone else. So you'll hear Gestalt language processor or Gestalt language learner used fairly interchangeably. And if you see these acronyms, that's what they are referring to. GLP is a common one you'll hear. Augmentative and alternative communication refers to any language or communication that is not using mouth words. We all use AAC every day with emails, text messages, writing, body language, all those things. And then I imagine most people who work with individuals with disabilities are familiar with the terms 504 and individualized education plan or an IEP, but I want to make sure to put those in here in case you're not. 504 is a baby IEP, essentially. It is a way of getting accommodations formally in place for a student, much like workplace accommodations for an adult. An IEP it can include accommodations, but it must include direct services like speech therapy or occupational therapy, reading supports, things like that. Okay. Any questions about that before I dive more deeply into what Gestalt language is? All right. So essentially, there are two types of language learners, analytic language learners and Gestalt language learners. And analytic language learning is what we often think of as being the default of being, you start by babbling and then you say one word at a time. When you get to about 50 words in your expressive lexicon, then you start combining into 2 words and then longer and longer phrases until you get to self-generated grammar and fluent speech. Gestalt language learning is kind of the opposite of that. And there are some theories that analytic language learners do actually go through the stages of Gestalt language learning, but they go through them so quickly that it's not picked up on by those around them. But we're not entirely sure. Gestalt language processing is a little bit the approaches to Gestalt language processing, there are controversial opinions out there. There are opinions out there that this is a controversial approach. It's not, it's just using a different term for something that everybody knows exists, which is that autistic individuals repeat things that they hear. And it's just a way of supporting them using existing language strategies, but it's advocating for not using the ones that are found to be unhelpful or get that language development kind of stuck. So if you ever hear about somebody saying like, I've heard that's kind of controversial, you don't need to necessarily defend Gestalt language processing, but it's just, I think, important to know that there are some differing opinions out there on how best to support Gestalt language processors. So Gestalt language processing has 6 stages that have been described by Marge Blanc. This is also called natural language acquisition, or NLA. You'll see that term throughout my slides as well. Not all Gestalt language processors are autistic, but a great portion of autistic individuals have been found to be Gestalt language processors. So just because a kiddo is Gestalt language processor, you shouldn't automatically assume that they are autistic, and you shouldn't automatically assume that they need speech therapy either. Gestalt in stage 1, which is where they have been repeated exactly as their original source said them, are always meaningful. They should not usually be taken literally. They're usually tied to an emotional or dramatic experience, and it's the emotional tie that is the meaning. So for example, kids hear swear words said with a lot of emotion and intonation and then will repeat them. And they don't necessarily know what the word means, but they know the emotion behind it that they heard an adult in their life say it with. And they start using it in those contexts. The big thing about Gestalt language processors is that as adults supporting them, we do not choose what is meaningful and salient to them. They do. Like they are, even if we are modeling phrases, doesn't mean that they're going to start using them, because either it's not what they're actually wanting to say and communicate, or it's just boring. It doesn't matter how many times you repeat it or try to get them to say it or make them say it. Like if it's not meaningful, it's just not going to stick. Or it'll get stuck. So those kids who learned to say more and help, and that's it doesn't ever turn into a sentence like, I want some more cookies, or I need some help opening this, right? It just becomes this stuck one word because it was taught to them as a cause and effect type of thing, not as an actual unit of language and communication. One of the examples I like to give with this is like if you are at the fair with a kid and he sees the Ferris wheel and is watching it spin and is seeing the lights and is like, wow, that's so cool. And then his sister says, I want a hot dog. And then later, maybe toys, and you hear him say, I want a hot dog. It doesn't mean he's hungry or wants a hot dog. He may not even like hot dogs, but he makes this association with, I'm feeling so happy. I like watching things spin. I'm feeling calm and regulated. And that is the phrase that I heard in that moment. And that's the emotion I'm trying to express. Gestalt language processors are also often cognitive processors, which means that, I mean, this is probably more familiar to mental health providers than it is to me, but processing things as a whole experience, which is one of the main theories behind why routines are so regulating and why disruptions to the routine are so dysregulating to Gestalt language processors. And I'll get into that more a little bit later and ways that we can support that. But for now, I'm going to focus on the language aspect. So as I said, analytic language processors we call it like bottom-up processing, right? Start with small and go to big. They see single words as being the building blocks of language versus Gestalt language processors who start at that top of longer utterances, maybe sometimes so long that their motor speech capabilities are not able to make that intelligible because it's a whole script from an entire movie and you hear them kind of muttering it and some clear words here and there, but not whole things. Language is processed in these larger chunks and smaller pieces than grammatical morphemes, like the little endings of words, as the building blocks of language. But it starts with those biggest, most meaningful and emotional units of language. Sometimes that chunk is just the tune of the song or the intonation of a phrase. And I think a great example of this is when, as adults, we can remember the words from the chorus of a song, but then when we're listening to the rest of the song, we're kind of like humming along and maybe like saying like some of the general sounds of it, but not the actual words, or like I am not a Taylor Swift person, so I don't know the actual lyrics, but there was some Taylor Swift song that people thought it was like, I see 11 turkeys staring at me. I think it was Lavender Haze or something, but it's just great. Like, we don't necessarily know the actual individual words, but we remember generally how it goes. And this is very common in learning second languages as adults as well. Oh, okay. Is there a question in the chat? I saw the thing pop down. No, okay. So what does it mean to process language in chunks? The phrases are the building blocks of language. We take a whole script and then eventually start mixing and matching parts of it. And I'll have some examples of this on the next slide, I believe, as well. But eventually we get into self-generated grammar. However, the important thing to know is that answering questions is all but impossible while in stages 1 through 3, because there is not that flexibility in expressive language to accurately or reliably answer questions. A lot of times, if you ask a Gestalt language processor questions too early, either they take those questions and start using them as a Gestalt. These are the kids who ask, what is that? What is that? What is that? And then the parents are like, you know what that is, or something like that, right? Because they've been asked that, and so they see that as a way to engage socially, because that is how they are interacted with. So either they repeat those questions themselves as gestalts, or they remember the exact question and answer sequence of what color is this? And then they can pull out some learned gestalts for answering those. But then you ask them more complex questions, or if you change the order of the question, it's much harder because they weren't truly exercising their self-generated grammar capabilities to express a question. So it's one of the hardest things to change about the way you interact with Gestalt language processors, but not asking questions is incredibly important until they have shown that they have that flexibility in their expressive language abilities and can move words around within a sentence flexibly, and understand the specific meanings of individual words rather than just the emotional meaning of phrases. So like with learning a second language, as I said, a lot of people will know a whole phrase, even if they're not learning that language formally, like ¿Dónde está la biblioteca? They're like, oh yeah, I know what that means, or I know that phrase, but they don't know the individual word. Like está means it's like the present tense, third person conjugation of estar, or that, la biblioteca, like that there's, there's some gender agreement with those terms, right? We don't actually know the actual breakdown until you start learning the language more deeply. So people, yeah, so it's a common phenomena in learning a second language, and it does occur across bilingual children as well. And it's very interesting to see the language development and mixing and matching of gestalts from different languages as well. But if anyone ever asks about like, is this only in one language if they're multilingual, it usually occurs in both languages, but they might be in different stages in each language as well. That's also true of AAC users, actually. So an individual may be at one stage with their spoken words, but then at a different stage of Gestalt language processing with their AAC devices. So we never want to assume that we need to be programming an AAC device, or that like what they're saying on an AAC device needs to match exactly what they are saying or what we are saying. I'm not sure how many of you work with AAC devices, but throwing that out there. And yes, like I said, this is stage 4 is where they can start to reliably answer questions more accurately, but still not always fully accurately, but more accurately. As with all things, the progression through these stages is not usually linear. Most children who are in Gestalt language development are learning or are in multiple stages at once. And it can be helpful to get kind of a breakdown of where they're at in the stages. But as a speech therapist, I try not to focus too much on that because children do move into different stages, especially it really depends on how people are speaking to them, if there are other areas of development that are progressing, if they're in stage 4 and experimenting with grammar, for example, and they get overcorrected quite a bit, a lot of times they will stop experimenting with grammar and go back to stage 1 where they are repeating people who had perfect grammar and weren't being corrected. So it really is quite a fluid process, but generally it goes sequentially, and then once about 30 to 40% of their utterances are in a given stage, then that usually means they're ready to start being supported for moving into the next stage.
Kendra, can you remind us all what NLA stands for?
Yes, natural language acquisition. It is the term used for these stages of Gestalt language development. Thank you. So stage 2 is mixing and matching. Stage 3 is single words and recombinations. Children usually move fairly quickly through stage 3. Sometimes they skip it entirely or go so fast that we don't notice. And then stage 4 is the self-generated grammar. Here is some examples of what that can look like. So stage 1 might be saying Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. And then maybe they also had a phrase that said like, I love mommy. And then stage 2, they take parts of each of those phrases and combine them. Mommy sat on the wall. Or I love Humpty Dumpty. Both would be parts of those. One of them sounds a little more natural than the other. But these are two resources that I reference quite frequently, and I do have them at the end as well in the resources section, but the Gestalt Language Processing Handbook and the Gestalt on the Go. So I love the things that Gestalt language processors say. I find them hilarious. And so I've included some examples from kids that I have had and things that you might hear a lot too. So in stage one, a lot of times these are the kids who can say all of their ABCs, but then aren't necessarily, or parents might say they're not using words to communicate. They have memorized, numbers or names of flags, or they're starting to speak in Turkish, even though nobody in their family speaks in Turkish because they watch some YouTube videos of people speaking Turkish and now they say things in Turkish. I've had a kid who said London Bridge is falling down. And when we heard that, we were like, oh my gosh, she's going to go push down that block tower that another kid just made. And that was usually our signal that we needed to do some management there of some regulation and stuff. My other speech therapist at this school has a little banner in our room that says welcome to speech. And now when I see some of my Gestalt language processors, they see me and say welcome to speech. I don't need to go through all of these, but another common one that you'll hear is like when people use one specific term to refer to a general group. So like saying fish for all water animals, saying mama for all female presenting or long-haired people, saying milk for all things that they drink. Sometimes it's very unintelligible too. And if you ever see an XXX in something that I've written, that means unintelligible. And so like, snowman, and that usually means they're saying a script, but their motor speech capabilities may not be able to say all of the individual sounds, or it may be too long for their motor speech capabilities. What's that? I talked about that earlier. Good job is another one. There's nothing inherently wrong with saying good job if a parent asks you. I mean, I guess from a mental health perspective, say what you want about that. But kids start to say good job, and what they mean is like I had a parent who would say good job when a kid would like use her words, quote unquote, which is my least favorite phrase. But then whenever she like wanted something because she was being told use your words and then was told good job, she started saying good job to mean that she wanted something. It becomes quite convoluted, right? It's not great. And then we have to like backtrack of all these things. And so if we can just support them the way that they learn language from the get-go, we don't have to do as much backtracking. I do have some videos, but because I'm just having some issues with sharing the screen, I think I might hold off on sharing videos, but then at the end, go through them. But there are lots of videos on meaningful speeches, Instagram, and I think they have a YouTube as well that have examples in different stages. But like I said, I'll try and come back to these at the end if I can figure out technology. Sorry. So stage 2 is one of the most difficult stages, I think, to understand the meaning of the Gestalt, or it's called a mitigated Gestalt. It's difficult to understand. Ideally, if we've been supporting their language as good language partners and providing models according to like the best practices, it'll be things that make sense, like it's time to blank, right? Like, and they can kind of swap out the different parts that this ends, or like, that's not what I want. That's not my favorite. That's not time to play, things like that. Or, these are definitely things that can start a stage 2 phrase, but often this is what it sounds like. That's not go there. Combination of that's not and something go there. And these are taken from some language samples of kids that I've done. I need something to the beak. I love what to wears. It's go to this one. Need help the shoe on. It's so monsters down here. Sometimes it's just one word that's been swapped out. It's not a whole chunk paired with another chunk. It's kind of like a phrase with one removable piece. It's clock. Don't worry, blue will help you. And then don't worry, green will help you. And then did that for all of the colors. What's the match house? Take it off the gemstone. And again, this is one where it's not literal. The kid meant take the gemstone out. But they didn't have that phrase. They didn't have out in one of their stage 1 gestalts. They only had take it off. And so that's what they used because that's what they had access to in their lexicon. Don't broke it. That's my Christmas. It's great stuff. It sometimes feels a little bit like a superpower when I'm able to figure out like what they actually meant. But yeah, so this is why it can be so important to support kids early on, is that we can help them be more clearly understood by others who aren't going to take the time to do the detective work to figure out what they mean. Stages 3 and 4 are, so stage 3 is, it can also be a single word. So like I said earlier, fish to refer to all water animals is often a stage 1 thing. It's just that common like associative learning practice, right? Like this is also why so many Gestalt language processors, when they hear something, share about their own real world experience, because that's how they learn, is by tying it to their own experiences and things that they understand and have like an existing frame of reference to. In stage 3, you might hear that same word, but it's more literally used a lot of times with a point like fish and pointing to an actual fish, or saying there and then pointing over there. That referential pointing and more literal meaning is how you can kind of tell the difference if you are trying to. And then stage 4, a lot of times parents and adults who are less familiar with Gestalt language processing will start to display some panic when kids get into stage 4, because it sounds like quote unquote regression. It sounds like their grammar is getting worse because they are experimenting with these grammar rules for themselves. They are overgeneralizing the past tense ed marker, and that's good. We want them to do that. We don't want them to just be repeating things that they've heard, because then they're reliant on only things that they've heard. So it might sound like the surface get away and he's pretty dirty, or there is, or we gonna play with the whole 3,000 million. It does not always make sense, and most of the time there you can figure it out if you kind of put aside the grammar and then also reference back what is that original gestalt from. But it does take some work. So ways that you could actually, before I move on to this, are there any questions about the stages? I know that this is not a speech therapist focused training, so I don't expect anyone to be able to recognize what stage a kid is at or what stage a phrase is, but it's helpful to see how it progresses, I think, and see kind of what's coming. Yeah, so any questions?
There's nothing in the chat so far, except some appreciation. Oh, what might be some signs that we would see in therapy would prompt us to refer to an SLP?
Oh, great. Did you see my next slide? Um, so Gestalt language processors do not inherently need speech therapy. However, if they are not showing signs that they're progressing through those stages on their own, then they may, because usually when kids are not progressing into self-generated grammar on their own, even if it's later than the developmental norms, because they follow different norms, right? But if they're progressing on their own, they're probably going to get all of the rules of grammar on their own and develop language just fine. But if they're not and they are kind of stuck, it can lead to those negative practices of the adults around them, where they are starting to feel some of that anxiety and panic and really pressuring them to speak and asking more questions and telling them, say this, say more. And then the kids start saying, say more, and they're like, oh no. So if there's that like lack of movement through the stages, that can be a pretty strong indicator. And then yeah, so we'll go through some of the signs that someone might be a Gestalt language processor, but just know that this does not inherently mean they need speech therapy. But a lot of the times, adults do not speak to children in a way that is going to set them up for success of developing that language development skill if they are not already progressing on their own. So these are the kids who might say things that seem out of context, like with the hot dog, right? If they say, I want a hot dog, you're like, you don't even like hot dogs. Like you just ate. I don't know what you're talking about. Like why you're not hungry. But there is a connection. The connection is just not literal. It's based on emotion, not the semantic meaning. They may use an odd tone of voice. It may sound robotic, it's been referred to. I don't like that term, but that is something that parents will sometimes say, is that it sounds robotic. And that can be that they have apraxia of speech, so they have a kind of halting nature to their speech, or that they are copying like Bluey, who speaks in an Australian accent, or I don't remember the other ones, but there's like a Ukrainian show that I have a kid who would copy and ended up with a Ukrainian accent. And so those types of things, right, where it's like their tone of voice doesn't really match that natural flow. And that sometimes is a strong indicator that someone is moving into the later stages, is that it does start to sound more natural. Like in stage 1, they sound like Miss Rachel. They say, put it in. And you're like, that's not how a kid would say that. You heard that from someone else. But yeah,
Um,
sometimes these, oh, go ahead.
oh, we have a question of like, what would be a useful way to respond to that hot dog sentence?
That's a great question. So repeating things back is always helpful, and then modeling from the kid's perspective what it does seem to be that they mean. We will go through some suggestions later on, but in general, like if you're familiar with the concept of declarative language, speaking from the child's perspective, a shared perspective, or a neutral perspective, to be like, I love this. I'm so happy. Like I love spinning. I like watching lights, things like that. And then a lot of times you'll know, like, so offering an option of what they could say, but not asking them what they mean. And then they'll let you know that you got it right, usually by either they stop repeating the phrase, because sometimes kids will just keep repeating the phrase until you get it right. They'll keep saying, I want a hot dog, I want a hot dog, I want a hot dog. And then when you say the right thing, when you say, I love lights, they'll stop repeating that. So that can be an indicator that you got it right, or they aren't repeating it. And then when you say, I love the lights, they might say, I love the lights. So, yeah, focusing on like what is going to help this kid in other situations, right? Like expressing their sensory needs, expressing their emotions. Yeah, it's not just requesting is the biggest thing. But yeah.
There's a question in the chat of, is this why there's so many neurospicy adults talk about struggling with taking on other people's speech patterns? And it doesn't go well because other people interpret this as mocking or bullying behavior?
Yes, that is a very common thing, is that like I think it's also that that just like that high level of sensitivity and pattern recognition that comes with a lot of neurodivergence, right? Is like not necessarily knowing consciously that they are picking those things up, but recognizing the pattern and being like, I need to start using that pattern to relate with this person. But it is certainly related to the Gestalt learning process. For some kids, especially the kids who probably don't need speech therapy, their vocabulary may be quite precocious. They may seem very articulate and very advanced in their language. And a lot of times that's because they have learned things from adults. They also may over articulate and over enunciate things very clearly. That can be a sign that someone is a Gestalt language processor. That is one that usually means they may not need speech therapy though, if they already have that flexibility in their language. This is what I was referring to earlier. They'll repeat it back until you say it correctly. Or sorry, until you repeat it back correctly is a common thing that they will do. Like, even if they aren't clearly saying the specific words, but they want you to understand, like they're trying to communicate, right? And like the only way that they know that you got their message is that you repeat it back exactly. And so that is one of the biggest suggestions for to start is just to repeat back what you heard. And then if they keep repeating it, probably means you didn't get it right. And then I have some links at the end to websites of where you can look up phrases, even or partial phrases that are like quotes from TV shows and stuff, because it can be really helpful to identify the source and asking the parents the source. Like if they watch a lot of shows, like if you're like, oh, might be a quote from Bluey. I have a kid I'm trying to figure out the source of a phrase from right now. It's I don't want to go on the city bus. And I don't know what it means because she doesn't go on the city bus. And so, but she does watch a lot of Bluey. And so I'm like, maybe this is from Bluey. I don't know. But something that's helpful is having like a little spreadsheet shared between like parents and therapists and providers and teachers and stuff that's like, what did I hear? When and where did I hear it? Where do I think it might be from? And what do I think the meaning is? Can be really helpful. But sometimes you don't know. And in those cases, I will just kind of repeat back the intonation of the thing as best as I can. I will, if there's a question in the chat, I'm going to get to it at the end of this slide. I talked about the stuck single words, kiddos who copy the tone of phrases, and it's much clearer when they use these kind of copied phrases or like the ABCs, you can hear each letter individually, but then when they are speaking and trying to communicate more spontaneously, it's much less clear. That is often an indicator that someone is a Gestalt language processor. Loving music but hating when other people sing or try and join in their music is a classic Gestalt indicator. It's because you are not doing it right. You are not doing it exactly how they heard it the first time. And that is like, especially there are many non-speaking kids who are Gestalt language processors, but it's harder to tell sometimes, right? But if this is one of them, right? If they love music and love singing to a song, but if you start singing the ABCs different than how, oh, what's his name? One of the YouTube people sings it, like it's gonna lead to a meltdown or them covering your mouth or, those types of things. And then in the later stages, like I said, a way to kind of recognize it is that it may seem like their word order is mixed up. They may seem like they have younger grammar errors, even if they seemed more grammatical earlier. And it may seem to quote unquote regress. But this is a lot of times when I really try and support parents and understand that this is the goal and this is an important stage and that this is not true regression. And I think that is a very helpful thing to have all therapists or all providers, reinforcing. Okay, were there any questions in the chat?
Not any new ones from the chat, but I'm just a little curious. I have two kids, one kid speech delayed, obviously, like, looking back, has had Gestalt learning, continues to have some like speech differences. My other kid was more like me. They started speaking when they were 9 months old. But like when I'm thinking about the way that like they presented, it was so similar to mine. I think that mine was exactly like this. It just went really fast. I just taught myself to read when I was 3. I just taught myself to speak in like full sentences. I like talk like an adult. Um, and so I'm curious about kids like that we sort of label as like hyperlexic, and then they get put into more gifted categories. And I'm wondering about if there's anything when we're working with young people with that, more that presentation of resources or what to do.
Yeah, I think so. Some individuals are dual language processors, analytic and Gestalt. It is less common, but it does happen. And then that hyperlexic presentation is a very common indicator that a kid is moving, like, not always, but they can move more quickly through the stages, especially if it's not just that they like letters, but that they are picking up on the patterns of phonology and phonetics rather quickly, and then using written words to more quickly progress their grammar and their language skills. When you're asking about like supports for them, do you mean supports when they're like learning language, or do you mean in school? Or can you clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how so many parents just try to put them into the gifted track, and it seems like there are a lot of other needs that are occurring. And it's much more difficult if, like, for a 504 and IEP to say this person is experiencing all these issues. I know that for my younger kid who was an early talker, I couldn't get any support um, for them in school until they got much older because they were just interpreting as anxiety or, oh, this is a motor issue where like their thoughts are too complex for their words and let's just like watch them stutter and sort of sputter out in class. Um, and I work with so many kids where they're like exceptional at like something that people have identified, and then they don't get any of the other supports. And so I didn't know if like might be good to like refer them to like a private SLP to help them sort of like have some more scaffolding, or if there's anything else that I should be considering when they're small.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know how familiar you are with like the spiky profile, but I think referring to that would be a very important aspect of advocating in the schools, but it is so challenging. And then I think to give you a little bit of reassurance, the stuttering, a lot of times that happens with Gestalt language processors when they're in later stages. We actually refer to using a different word than traditional stuttering. We use the term mazing, M-A-Z-E or M-A-Z-I-N-G. It's usually related to them trying to kind of in their brain stutter their way or trip through the ways of forming a sentence because they're not fluent in it yet. It sounds a lot like if you aren't fluent in a second language and you're trying to get directions and you might restart, you might say a lot, you might, and then that combined with the motor process or the motor planning difficulties that a lot of times co-occur can sound like stuttering. And using some of the supports for individuals who stutter in that instance can be helpful, but mostly just kind of letting it happen, and like and not interrupting and not trying to say things like take a breath or slow down or things like that. Um, but yeah, I think a if they're still having communication difficulties and aren't being able to communicate what they think or want or their full ideas, then it could be that they are just needing speech and language supports, but more on the language side of things and less on the actual, like when I say like, I mean like the higher level language skills of like receptive and expressive language and like understanding how words go together and things like that, rather than start just knowing how to develop language and communication skills as a um, emerging communicator, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question? I don't know if I fully answered it or not. I'm sorry.
No, that's lovely. That's lovely. And then there's some curiosity also in the chat related to adults. And so how would we support adults who maybe never got interventions, or how might that show up and what might that look like?
That is a great question, and I do not have as good of an answer for that one because I work exclusively with kids. However, I think that finding a provider who is trained in Gestalt language processing, the premises are probably still going to apply, but they just might not need as long term of speech therapy as they would when they were younger. And still, because if they are older and have developed a lot of those self-generated grammar skills, they may need supports, but they may not. They may not need, it's okay to use Gestalt. Everybody is going to be using stage one Gestalts to a certain degree. So it's not something that we need to eliminate. But if they feel like they aren't able to communicate what they think effectively, then a Gestalt language trained SLP, and there are, I should have linked this, but there are like registries online where you can find a Gestalt language trained speech language therapist. Um, You might also recognize Gestalt language cognitive processors, especially kids, by some of the things I mentioned earlier, like having very strong episodic memory, um, going to the park and eating a sandwich on a bench one time, and then a dog starts barking and they get scared. And then the next time you go to the park, they see the bench and start having a meltdown or a panic attack before anything happened because they have that strong association. Um, these are also kids who see toys as complete sets. So the set of Toy Story minifigures is the toy. And if you took one of those away, it's like ripping the arm off of a doll. It is ruining the set. It is not, it's not complete, right? It is ruined now. And so as much as you can, if these kids want a whole set of something, having your own duplicate set of that toy to play alongside can be really helpful. Lining up things and doing things in the same order. The play might also look like acting scenes out. I also had a kid one time who would like always do this and do this like very specific dance, and we couldn't figure it out. It took about a month, and then the parents figured out that it was this like hello song that they did at preschool, and this was like the sun rising or something. And then it was just like you remember, like you are doing this thing that is like this dance, and you remember it and are doing it, and that is fun and calming. um these kids also have really strong memory for locations. um Driving down the street and then not turning in to go see Miss Kendra for speech therapy is very distressing because that's the street we're on. And they had to start taking a different street to go to Fred Meyer. And I was like, oh man, but very strong memory for direct places, directions, and visuals. Gestalt language processors, you typically, if they want to remember something, they only need to hear it once. And so when we say a phrase, or when parents say a phrase and try and say it over and over and over to get them to say it, it's like if they wanted to remember this, they would. It's not meaningful to them. So we need to offer other options of what they could say and other models and things like that. If kiddos are non-speaking and they like watching videos, a lot of times they will rewind to the exact same point in the video and rewatch that. That is a strong indicator that they are a Gestalt language processor. And then daily events and routines and transitions, not having time to finish what they are doing before moving on to something else is a lot of times because of that whole, they haven't finished the gestalt. They haven't finished that whole episode, and they're being asked to interrupt it and stop. And it's very distressing. And the same thing when routines are unpredictable or have been changed, or even if they've been told that the routine is different, but it wasn't told to them in a way that accessed their means of comprehension and matched their kind of language processing style, it can be really difficult. And these kids are often described as being rigid or non-compliant or behavioral. And obviously that is not exactly what's going on. So I know that it's almost 11 o'clock. I do have a good number of strategies and supports that are included. How are we doing on time, Marie? Like, do we have maybe 10 minutes to go through these, or should we
Yeah,
get?
absolutely. Do you have I've got a couple questions in the
Oh,
chat.
okay, sure.
First, I just wanted to say that the Gestalt processing for cognitive style was like super helpful for understanding, I think, how as a therapist to work with adults. I feel like it also illuminates some things that I just experience and helps give context. So one of the questions is actually around sort of the toys being a set, and is that part of why so many of us love to collect things?
Yeah. I think collecting things and then like seeing that like variability, right? Like of like, okay, I know what Bluey looks like, and I want to get all of the Blueys. I want to form a complete gestalt in my brain of all the possibilities of what it can look like. And then just I think some of it is also just autistic joy and not I don't know if it's necessarily related to that Gestalt cognitive processing, but yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of it too is like collecting sets of things. Like I know some people really collect like the same thing in different ways, but then collecting sets um so that you have like the full context, right? Or like really understanding like um or sorry, this is a slightly different topic, but like real I think it's related to not understanding something unless every detail is established. And so you might get corrected a lot by a Gestalt language processor. And it's not because they are trying to, you know, be arrogant or establish their superiority or something like that. But it's because that is how they process language is, okay, we have to get all of the details, all of the context for this entire gestalt before I can draw any sort of conclusions or externalize that information. Yeah.
And then one more question,
Mhm.
which is um, when we're talking about like analytical versus Gestalt, is it the question is like, is it sort of a binary that you are, you aren't, or is it something more like a spectrum to sort of more fluid in that?
I think I think it can be hard to tell when people are older, like what type of processor they were or weren't. And I think we all end up in the stages of analytic language processing, or that's the goal of teaching those stages of language development. Some individuals will be minimally speaking and non-speaking, and that's okay, right? Like it's okay to not get to the self-generated grammar stage. Like that is part of being highly impacted and being autistic. However, if you are progressing through those stages and are at stage 4, it does end up in mostly that self-generated grammar, which is goes into stages 5 and 6. But as I said, most people are not in any one stage at one time. We retain some of that gestalt um, processing style. And it's also just very calming and soothing. Like sometimes kids are scripting things not because they are trying to communicate with someone, but because the meaning behind it is I'm dysregulated and I need to calm myself down. And this is something familiar and predictable, and I know how it goes. And that's the meaning. So it certainly can be both. I think most people do go through both stages, regardless of where you start. Um, but it's more the speed at which you go through all the stages, and if you do go through all of the stages. Um, I apologize if there's other questions in the chat. I am going to keep going just for the sake of time. Um, One of the most important things to support a Gestalt language processor with is by acknowledging any and all communication, especially young children who are minimally speaking, who are in stage 1 or just starting to use some stage 1 utterances. Even if you don't know what they say, nodding, saying, yeah, maybe trying to interpret what you think they mean if possible. But if not, like I said, even just repeating back the intonation of what they said can make them feel heard and give them that confidence of, okay, I'm not speaking to a wall. Somebody is hearing me. My message is being received. I'm going to keep trying and not I keep saying this and they keep thinking it means this. I'm not going to keep saying that because it's not being, they're either ignoring me or not responding in the way I want. Generally, if you think someone has said something, but you're like, I swear they're 9 months old and they said, I want to go to the store. assume they said it, because even if they didn't say it, if you repeat it back to them, it's going to encourage them. But a lot of times, Gestalt language processors did say it, and you might not hear it again, and that's okay, right? It might have been meaningful and salient in that moment, and then it just didn't stick long term, and that's natural. Um, Language skills, so expressive and receptive language skills often exceed motor speech capabilities for Gestalt language processors. So sometimes they're trying to say something and it's not super clear, but you can tell like they're saying, ah, you're like, I think they said I love you. Yeah, they said I love you. That's how you always say it to them, and they said it back. Um, the One of the other things that's important is to speak naturally. We want Natural conversation is not made up of prompts to say, can you say, I want a cookie? Or can you say, da 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 da? Like, because kids start saying, can you say, as part of their gestalt, or they start asking lots of questions. And that's not how conversation is naturally. When in doubt, use declarative language. So making statements that are not directives, that are not questions, that don't require any response. They are opportunities for an individual to copy what you said or copy it later, an opportunity for them to engage. These are all some of the things that if you work with PDAers, these are the same principles, right? It draws attention to ideas. The ball's over there. It fell down, right? It's not like, can you pick that up? It fell down, and it's fine if it did, and we want to leave it there. Builds connection. The question and answer testing dynamic is so harmful for the language development skills of a Gestalt language processor. Like, as much as you can, focus on teaching language and not testing it. Like, don't make them prove that they can say something. If you know that they know their colors, you don't need to prove it to me. You don't need to prove it to anyone. You don't need to be asking them, what color is this? We need to be teaching them other things, and they learn by copying. So say the things exactly how you would want them to say it. Just model. It's red if they don't know their colors, or it's so big, it's bumpy, I like it. That's funny. Go away. Don't do that. Don't touch me, right? Self-advocacy statements are often overlooked, but they are the most important thing for a kid to be able to communicate. And you can model it with books like Go Away, Big Green Monster. You can model it with like, don't touch the button, right? Don't touch that. Don't touch me. Don't touch my foot. Don't do that. Like all those things are important to model. And then showing how fun communication can be and that it's not a task to be completed using really highly enriched intonation. There's been so many studies on motherese and that like baby talk and how it really is beneficial for babies. Like they pick up on that intonation. And that's why a lot of kids also really like Miss Rachel is because she uses that very rich intonation and it's meaningful to kids who like music. We focus on building the intrinsic motivation to communicate with declarative language rather than you're only communicating because I asked you a question or I told you to say something. Like that is not a true independent or autonomous communicator. We want them to choose if they're going to copy something or say something. And this is another example of how you can transition directives or questions to declarative statements. Supporting their comprehension and processing, declarative language is helpful. Using routines, but then using routines in flexible ways from the get-go of like, okay, we did this one time this way, and then the next time we did something entirely different and not kind of using a routine can help comprehension, but then if you use a routine too strictly, it can really lead to that dysregulation if it's something that they're not going to be able to always have done in that same routine way. I sing all day long. Everything is a song. Everything is to various tunes and it's one of the most effective ways to help support comprehension and processing for kids. It also really helps support transitions. If you have a consistent song like the cleanup song, or I don't know what tune it is, but I do like we're going back to class, we're going back to class, like, just anything, right? But then do it consistently because that can be more salient. The tune of that song is what helps them comprehend that a transition is coming up much more than the individual words or just saying thing over and over and over. We got to go, get your shoes on, it's time to go, got to go fast, we're late, we got to go, get in the car, come on, let's go. Like that's so much information. Every time you say something new, it's resetting their processing clock, which is the next thing. Say less and listen more. Like the more things you say, it's resetting their processing clock. And then if you say something and they repeat it under their breath quietly, but you were already saying the next thing, you're not going to hear what they said. Like you're going to miss a lot because there is usually a little bit of a delay in that like imitation or in their response. And that's, we have to leave room for that. Using visuals and not just the visual of a written word, but like actual pictures or symbols. So like pictures of the physical thing, but also like symbol sticks or those AAC type of symbols for visuals can be really supportive. And then modeling phrases for a wide variety of things, not just requesting, assuming that if a child can do something, they will do something, right? Is always like kind of the overarching premise here. We don't need to keep prompting them to do something. We need to support their choices in doing something and giving them a variety of ways to access communication. Similar for expressive language, model without expectation. I'm going to keep moving on because we're running out of time, but this asterisk at the bottom is that there is a slide, like I said, with the websites to look up where scripts come from and where gestalts come from. But if you have a family who is looking for speech to language supports, I think it's important to let them know that like traditional speech language therapy may not be what helps. Like if this child, or even if a child has been in speech therapy for a long time and doesn't seem to be making progress, they may need to seek out someone who is who's trained in Gestalt language processing. These are all things, all of those supports you can ask for at school. You can ask for accommodations for regulation, for people to use like songs and visuals for routines, for having visual schedules, having personalized social stories of like, here's what this upcoming thing is going to be. Schools a lot of times love social stories for reinforcing neurotypical behavior and expectations, and that is not what we want. And so that's, I'm sure you know that, but in case you don't know what schools like to do, they do that a lot. And so be specific when you're asking for the support of social stories. And then putting potential gestalts in those social stories of, I'm upset, or I might be upset. It's okay to be upset. I need a break. I can go get my Chewy. I can go here. I can see Miss Kendra, things like that. Asking schools specifically to reference the pyramid of learning and like, hey, are they dysregulated? Don't expect them to learn. Don't be asking them questions about their feelings right now. Like wait until later to be doing that type of thing. An accommodation I often put in is to allow for extended processing time before repeating a question or directive. I also put that in there. So I put it in for both regulation or for academic accommodations. Young, like kindergartners and first graders who are Gestalt language processors. I guess it could be anyone, but I'm thinking of a few kids in particular in their kindergarten and first grade. We put accommodations in their IEP to provide multiple demonstrations of response examples before expecting performance. So when we're doing like district learning baselines every quarter or something, the resource teacher, who's wonderful here and has learned so much about Gestalt language processing, she does I have two, I add two more. Now I have 4. I have 3. I add 4. Now I have 7. And she does that like a couple of times and then just gives the paper to the kid and says it, but then doesn't say the last thing, because that is an example of like, okay, we're picking up on the pattern, and then I can use kind of that Gestalt learning processing style to answer it more accurately. It's still not going to be great, but they are required to do testing. Allowing for multiple ways to demonstrate knowledge, and decreasing questions as much as possible. You can also ask for people to be trained in declarative language, for AAs or for paraeducators and staff to be trained on aided language modeling, which uses it's essentially the declarative language strategy, but for more specific to AAC. And then I referenced having a spreadsheet that's shared between providers is really helpful. And then if you have someone who is going through initial testing or even a reevaluation at the school, you can ask, I mean, they don't have to say yes, but you can ask for the speech therapist to not do standardized testing. A lot of times we're told that we have to if the child can sit and point to pictures. And just because they can sit and point to pictures doesn't mean that this is an accurate picture of their language abilities. You can ask them to use the communication matrix instead, or a language sample, and analyze it via the NLA or the developmental sentence sequence, which is what DSS says, and I should have typed that out. Little summary. I'm not going to go over all these. This is a little one-page handout that of like general principles and strategies that I made with some coworkers a few years ago. It's not fully comprehensive, but it's very helpful. I probably shouldn't have included this slide here. This was I sent these slides out in the past, and this is the PDF is linked in here. But yeah, it's helpful. And then these are the links to determining media source. And if you're interested in learning more, I've got some great Instagram accounts. I highly recommend Meaningful Speech and the Sensory SLP, and the child-led SLP. The other two are also great, but those three I reference quite a bit. Playtime with Tor, if you have a child or individual who likes videos, Playtime with Tor is Miss Rachel, but for Gestalt language processors. She's a speech language pathologist. She uses music. She talks about routines. It's wonderful. So Playtime with Tor, biggest recommendation I can give you. And then if you're interested in videos of the stages, again, I don't know why I left this slide in here from my past thing. It reference these Instagram accounts, especially Meaningful Speech. She has a lot of videos at the different stages and has a highlight section on her Instagram of the different stages. So you can go through there to see different examples. Okay. I'm sorry for going over time, but thank you all for being so engaged and asking so many questions. That was lovely. But are there any other questions, or do we just need to be done? Because that's fine too if we are over time. I'm going to stop sharing.
Kendra, would it be okay for people to contact you with questions?
Absolutely, yeah.
Sick. So in that case, how about we stop the recording and transition to the next part of this meeting? And thank you so much. My mind has been blown over and over here.
Thank you. I'm very glad.